Good day, everyone. At the outset, it's indeed a pleasure to be here at this fourth edition of TEDx at RGNUL. It's also a pleasure for me to be here to speak to you about a topic that normally doesn't get spoken of in forums like these. And that's really about the foreign policy of our country. Because for a long time, the conventional wisdom was that foreign policy is not dealt with by common people like you and me. Foreign policy is dealt with by the elite of the country. And so if you were asked a question, what do you think about the foreign policy of your country? You would shrug your shoulders and say, maybe, I don't know, I don't have an opinion. And how does it matter? Even if I have an opinion, do I have the potential to shape things? Do I have the potential to change things? This was the conventional wisdom. But that's not true today. In fact, I recall that this very interesting change in our country happened, and I call it a democratic consensus on foreign policy, is when in 2006, 2007, we were at the high point of negotiating a civil nuclear agreement with the United States. It was happening during the premiership of Dr. Manmohan Singh. And interestingly, although nuclear issues are extremely complex issues, you would always vouch for that, it was refreshing to see people in this country talk about that agreement day in and day out, not just in universities or in forum places, but even at the street corner shops. And what you have seen since then is that there is this appreciation that what happens in the foreign policy space of the country matters to each one of us. There are two propositions that are often talked about Indian society. The first is that we are a time series people. Now, what does time series mean? It means that if you're asked something, you all the time talk about your 5,000 years of civilization. And you say, look, I have a 5,000 years long civilization. So how does it matter if I don't do something in 20 years? Well, I'm an ancient civilization of 5,000 years. That's one proposition about us. The second proposition is, as a society over the years, we have always focused on outlays, that is, trying to invest money in looking at outputs, but never looking at outcomes. And what is outcome? Outcome is, in fact, the most important determinant of what we do. When we put in our effort, there comes an output. But if that output is not productive enough and doesn't lead to something meaningful, that output has no meaning. And that's why for a long time, if you look at the historical sweep of India's foreign policy, what you saw on the world stage was that whenever we spoke, we were never taken seriously. Even when we proposed something, it was seen as symbolic. It was not seen as substantive. If you look at 1947 onwards, we have always looked at foreign policy when we have been in an existential crisis. So in 1947, we became a young nation, and we saw a Cold War in the world between United States and USSR. And we were forced to take a certain position, which was the middle ground. In 1971, again, we had a difficult situation in the war with Pakistan that led to the liberation of Bangladesh, East Pakistan, of course. Again, we had a difficult scenario. We had to bring ourselves out of that situation. We somehow managed to bring ourselves out of that situation by uniting with USSR. In 1974, we did our first nuclear test. The world put nuclear sanctions on us. Again, we were in an existential crisis. We had to find our way out of it. And in 1991, we were in the depths of economic despair with a very bad foreign exchange crisis. Again, we had to look at foreign policy. Each of these four instances are instances when we had to change our foreign policy because circumstances forced us to change. But today, we are not in that position. We don't need to change our foreign policy because circumstances ask us to change. We are transitioning our foreign policy because we consciously believe we need to change it. And that is the change in our national interest. I'll come back to an incident which happened in 2014. When Prime Minister Modi took over, he had an informal summit of South Asian leaders whom he invited for his swearing in. I'm sure some of you might be aware of it. And at that time, he used that forum to make an announcement. He said, India will unilaterally develop a satellite for all the SAARC nations. Now think of it, a satellite. Normally, big countries do what? They provide defense cooperation. They provide economic aid. They don't provide satellites. But this is the idea and the practice of a new foreign policy of India, that we are not talking in terms of only economics or in terms of defense. We are actually looking at providing capacity to smaller states in our neighborhood, which can make a socio-economic impact. And let me tell you why this is important. Because in 1971, when Bangladesh was created, immediately thereafter, they requested India for satellite data to basically predict the weather for meteorological reasons. And India turned them down politely, saying, we can't give you this data because it is against national security. So what was against national security then, today we are consciously ourselves proposing a satellite, and we have done it for all SAARC nations. If you look at India, India is unique because we are not just a young political nation, we're an ancient civilization. And so when we talk of foreign policies in the world, one concept that is often talked about is neighborhood. Neighborhood. United States has a neighborhood, Europe has a neighborhood, Australia has a neighborhood. They have blessed neighborhoods because their neighborhoods are very benign. They're very peaceful by nature. We are in a neighborhood that is very troubled in South Asia. But if we only look at ourselves as a country with an immediate neighborhood, we would be doing great disservice to ourselves as a nation. And that's why what we have done in our foreign policy lately is to, not like other countries, look only at what we call as a geographical neighborhood, because India doesn't have only a geographical neighborhood. India has a geographical neighborhood, which is our immediate countries who are our neighbors. But because we are an ancient civilization with long contact and footprint and cultural influences going back millennia, we have what is called as a geocultural neighborhood that extends to Southeast Asia, that extends to West Asia, that extends to Central Asia. And then, because India is what it is today, which is a top rising power and an emerging economy, we also have a geo-economic neighborhood. We are an important economic proposition in the world's economic mobility. And so when we draft and carve our foreign policy today, we don't look at only geographical dilemmas. We look at geographical, we look at geo-economic, and we also look at geocultural opportunities. And that's why you see India's foreign policy over the last few years, through, of course, the Prime Minister's travels, becoming much more global in scope. This globalism comes from the very nature and the profile of what India is. You also look at India's cultural influences elsewhere. Not many countries in the world can talk of a diaspora that India can speak about. 40 million people and counting, spanning more than 100 countries of the world. You will find an Indian in more than 100 countries of the world. Now, the old traditional thinking was, oh, well, these are our people who are working abroad. Many of them work there because the salaries are good and they send money back. So we look at them as nothing but our people working abroad and sending remittances back home to India, like it happens to many states, including the state I come from, which is Goa, which has a lot of people working in the Gulf. But to only look at them in terms of people remitting money back would be a case of looking at them like guinea pigs. And they're not that. Indian diaspora is not guinea pigs. Indian diaspora is a tremendously important instrument that India can leverage in terms of achieving India's national interest. And we have seen that over the last 20 years in no less than the strongest democracy of the world, the US, where Indians have become very vocal, Indians have become very politically ambitious, and as a result of that, you see that when it came to the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, out of 100 senators, we got 94 senators to back that deal, which was an exceptional deal given to India by making an exception of India. This would not have happened had we also not had the support of our diaspora. And that's why it's very important to appreciate that. The third aspect is tourism. You know, many people are very surprised when I talk about this on many forums and they say, what are you talking about tourism and foreign policy? It makes no sense. Well, it does. And if you want to see the relationship between foreign policy and tourism, look no further than China. China today is a country that uses its tourism potential to punish countries in the world. If they want to punish a country, they don't need to send their military necessarily to punish you. They can do that by simply telling their tourists, do not go to that country. And of course, because they're not a democracy, they will have to follow the rules. You look at Maldives, our neighbor. Right now, Maldives has a government that is a little pro-India, and they have taken a certain view against Chinese investments in Maldives. The Chinese very politely and subtly told them, don't forget, 300,000 Chinese visit Maldives every year, and you're earning money from that. If Chinese stop visiting, well, you know what's going to happen. Now, that's one way of looking at tourism. But if you look at India and tourism, this can be the clearest building block between us and the world. Because what you see in India is not just one India. There are constellations of India within India. In fact, many in the world admire and say you are like a mini Europe in terms of how different states of India are. And appreciating this diversity within Indian foreign policy has also been a very important aspect of our policy. If you see right now, many states of the country are playing a very, very important role in terms of shaping the overall responses of India's foreign policy. Because taking states along in carving up a national foreign policy is also a very important thing. If you look at how we express ourselves, last year at the G20, G20 is a grouping of 20 of the rising economies of the world, the powerful economies of the world. We had the UN Secretary General at the time come and compliment Prime Minister Modi. And he told him, Mr. Prime Minister, I thank you for your leadership on the world stage, for taking action to mitigate climate change, to deal with climate change. The Prime Minister very politely told him, thank you very much, but actually we are not doing this because anyone's nudging us or forcing us to do it. As far as this government is concerned, we are doing this because we believe that combating climate change is in keeping with the Indian ethos. Because the Indian ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam has actually told us that we have to live in harmony not only with human beings, we have to live in harmony with the nature that is around us. And that explains our policies. There was a time when we floated certain initiatives. Like in the 1970s, we spoke about something called as a zone of peace. No one took us seriously. They just ignored us. In 1988, Rajiv Gandhi proposed at the United Nations a disarmament plan. He told the world, let's not have any nuclear weapons. Let's be weapons free for peace. No one took us seriously. They just laughed it off. They said, oh, this is India. What can India do? India can only talk, and India can't do anything else. Today, come 2017, we, in collaboration with the French, in an India-French collaboration, were able to put together an initiative called the International Solar Alliance. It is headquartered now in Gurugram. And interestingly, it is a treaty, it's a UN treaty which has the signatures of 122 countries of the world. So India floats an initiative that is backed by 122 countries of the world, when in the past, it was difficult to get even a handful of countries to back you on something like this. So it's an appreciation and an admiration that India has a role to play. Now, what does India do on the world? What is this Indian role that we have? Is it simply because India has begun now to sound to the world as though it is the most important country in terms of the 3 Ds? What are the 3 Ds? Democracy, demography, and demand. After all, if you see the world today in globalization, if anybody asked you, what is this global world? I would reduce it down to 2 words. 1, aspiration. 2, apprehension. These are 2 juxtapositions. These are 2 opposites. Aspiration. Everybody is aspirational today. Look at the millennial community. It's aspirational. Today, if someone comes and tells you, wait for 30 years for change to happen, will you accept it? No way. You want change in 5 years. You want change in 10 years. Similarly, there is an apprehension. In many parts of the world, people are migrating. People are moving from one place to the other. But look at how the responses to migration are happening. You look what's happening in Europe now. Even though Europe is such a diverse continent, is Europe able to, within itself, accommodate the people who are coming, who are non-European, who are coming from North Africa? They are unable to do so. But look at India. We are a country that can really speak to the world in terms of our diversity of democracy and the lessons we learn from that. Because although we may have more than 800 million Hindus in India, we are also the 2nd most populous Muslim country of the world. And that's why at the beginning of this year, when we were invited to this body called the OIC, and late Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj ji visited, and she was the guest of honor at that meeting, it was not to please India. It was an appreciation of what India is today. India can manage both aspirations, and we are also capable of keeping away apprehensions. And in your foreign policy, if you can deal with these two things, you can go a long way. For a long time, Indian foreign policy, operated through its diplomats, was very defensive. You know, you always told a diplomat, he said, I think it's better not to take a decision. You know, when India used to be at the UN, you have to vote certain times. Most of the time, India's voting used to be abstention. Abstain. What's the meaning of abstain? You neither vote for, you neither vote against. Normally, you do this when you are not able to decide. Now, if you as a major power, rising power in your foreign policy, if you will constantly take positions of abstention, nobody's going to take you seriously because they will think you just don't have it in you. But you see today, India is beginning to consciously articulate its narrative on the world stage. I still am reminded of the fact that in 2014, when Prime Minister Modi attended his first G20 summit in Australia, he raised the issue of black money. And he said one of the big things we have to deal with as a global community is to deal with the scourge of black money. Of course, he had begun taking actions in his own country. He talked about it. The other leaders acknowledged it. By next year, there was a working group on this in the G20. And by 2016, major economies like United States and Germany had begun to work in tandem to be able to deal with the issue of black money. In 2014, Prime Minister Modi spoke from the rostrum of the United Nations General Assembly. This was an interesting year because in 2015, we came up with what is called as the move towards the sustainable development goals in the world. I'm sure many of you will be aware of it. Everyone talks about health, but do we talk about wellness going beyond health? Health is what? You take medicine, your health is fine. But when you will perform yoga, when you will actually give into Ayurveda, you are not just dealing with your health. You are dealing with a comprehensive rejuvenation of the body, mind, and soul, which is exactly what wellness is all about. And that's why Prime Minister Modi spoke about the need for yoga to be made a part of the whole Sustainable Development Goal drive. The following year, we had 180 countries, almost 180 countries, support an Indian resolution for an International Yoga Day. Never in the history of the world has the world ever endorsed an Indian initiative with this much effusive support. And we are seeing it all through. I talked about the International Solar Initiative. And these are very important initiatives because they give Indian foreign policy a total different outlook. Let me just say this in conclusion. India is a unique country because over the years, India has never had a foreign policy doctrine. We have never had a national security doctrine. We, until a few years ago, did not have a maritime doctrine. We were a country which operated on drift. What is drift? Like a boat in the high seas which drifts. And we took ad hoc decisions from time to time. When the situation demands, we take a decision. But now, we are moving away from that kind of an operation to being able to move into a very conscious, confident atmosphere where we are trying to tell the world there is not only an Indian worldview of the world, there is also an Indian practice of statecraft in the world. Thank you very much.